And my name is Avani Sapra, and I'm a junior consultant at Turner & Townsend. We're joined today by Dan Leeming, also from Turner & Townsend. This is a retrofit information support and expertise event, which is fully funded by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero, delivered by Turner & Townsend. I will now hand over to Dan to start the presentation.
Thanks, Avani, for the wonderful intro there. Welcome to today's session on the challenge of retrofitting historic buildings. I'll just ping forward to the agenda so we can get a quick overview of sort of where we're at with this. So just wanted to run through some sort of key guidance, I guess, and then a little bit of sort of, why are historic buildings important, why retrofit them, a quick look at some basic building physics issues that really are important to, central really to consider when retrofitting historic buildings, and then some of the things quite high level. Didn't want to be too specific because they are very idiosyncratic and unique, each and every one, but looking at some of those possible areas you can look to carry out energy efficiency improvements in some of those buildings, and then a couple of sort of planning tools or things to be mindful of, I suppose, in regards to planning if you're looking at doing any retrofit to historic homes. And then at the end, we've just got a slide with a few links to a few resources, and I was just having a chat with a couple of my colleagues, and we'll probably pop a few more into the chat there as well. Links to maybe SPAB or the STBA, really good organizations that really specialize in this kind of thing. And if you're looking for a really good sort of, you want to get deeper into some of that technical detail of what you can do, then I definitely recommend sort of exploring further down that avenue. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's just dive straight in. So there's just a few terms I think that will come up in this. Some of you might sort of be familiar with them already, but I just wanted to run through because there's a lot of acronyms that you'll only encounter, or you'll mostly encounter here if you're coming from a retrofit sort of background, and you might not be necessarily familiar with all of them. So the first one there is the National Planning Policy Framework, the NPPF, which is sort of as it suggests, the sort of top-down plan for how we should be, how local planning authorities are supposed to sort of manage the areas that they're responsible for. So that sort of offers some direction for them in terms of sustainable development, plan making, decision making around housing, economy, town centres, communities, transport, environment, everything. And the most recent sort of national version of that came out, I think, in December 2023, so quite recently. And it's really it's the key document that local planners will be using to make their own specific plans for their local areas, and other stakeholders involved in land use planning in England. So the local plan, which is the third bullet point down there, that the National Planning Policy Framework states that planning should be sort of genuinely, it should be locally led and plan led. So their local planning authority should be keeping a succinct and up-to-date plan, for their particular area, and that needs to provide a framework for addressing those big key topics that are outlined in the NPPF. So housing needs is kind of the obvious one for our concern, but there will be other sort of crossover there as well in terms of addressing economic, social, and environmental priorities to that. And that plan as well has to be signed off, submitted to the Secretary of State, and signed off by an inspector. There's an independent examination, so it is quite a rigid, hierarchical thing, the planning system in England. We've talked about it a little bit already, mentioned the LPA, but just to be absolutely clear on that, the LPA is the local planning authority who is in charge of preparing that local plan, which takes those top-down topics from the NPPF and refines them into something suitable for the local area. Usually that's going to be the council or possibly the National Park Authority for a particular area. Permitted development. permitted development, something that I'm sure people are probably vaguely familiar with, possibly from if you've ever carried out works to your own homes. But they're essentially a set of rights that enable homeowners to improve or extend their homes. So that would be typically things like you might be able to put an extension on the back of a certain size or a certain outbuilding, that kind of thing. They are granted not by local authority. It is something that is granted at national level by the government, but those rights which apply to many common projects for houses, such as the extension or the outbuilding, they might not apply to things like flats, maisonettes, or other buildings, and commercial properties themselves have an entirely different set of permitted development rights as well. So it's broadly speaking, when we're looking at homes, there are sort of standard sets of things, but if you are looking at doing things like flats, maisonettes, might want to double check what is allowed for that particular type of property. And of course, with permitted development, modifications can be made to that by the local planning authority in line with their local plan, which is derived from the NPPF. So they can use things called Article 4 directions, which is another term you'll see on there, to kind of modify what you are or are not allowed to do to particular properties in particular areas. So I'm thinking particularly conservation areas here when I say that. And so it's always good idea to have where you can, a bit of an open conversation with your LPA around retrofit of certain archetypes that you're looking at, just to kind of be aware of these issues, because they're really, really important in shaping the direction of your project. Article 4 direction we've sort of already covered, but obviously the point of this more broadly is to kind of prevent incremental changes over the time, which could sort of, through permitted development, sort of erode typically conservation areas, unique qualities and appearances. So that's kind of where those come in. It's all about retaining a sense of placemaking effectively. Separate to Article 4 directions, there's also something called listed building consent, LBC. So if you live in a listed building and you want to alter, extend, or demolish it, and it's going to affect its character or appearance, you must first apply for listed building consent from your LPA. So when the LPA considers that application, whether it's going to grant permission to carry out what you want to do or not, it's going to look at really particular attention to the desirability of preserving particular features in the building, how it fits into its setting, why those features are special, and they'll come to a decision sort of based on those kind of things. And it is a criminal offence to carry out unauthorised works on a listed building, and if you do that and you get caught, you will have to reverse all those works. We've sort of seen that. I think briefly saw that story in the news about that wonky pub that burnt down in mysterious circumstances. I believe that has been ordered to be rebuilt brick by brick, effectively. So they are quite powerful, the laws around some of these things. And the last one on there is the local listed building consent order, the LLBCO, which is effectively a planning order, a tool that the LPA can use to grant listed building consent for an extended period of works of any particular description for the alteration of a bunch of listed buildings in an area. So I don't know, for example, maybe there's an area where you've got a particular bunch of listed properties, and for some reason the planning authority has said, oh yeah, we'd like to encourage solar PV use. We've weighed up all the the pros and cons of adding panels to the roofs on these properties. We're going to grant sort of a permission, blanket permission for a period of time, so that everybody can do those works, and you won't have to come and apply every single time for every single property. So a useful sort of blanket permission tool, effectively, and it's definitely something worth looking at. We might talk about that in a bit later. Just as a point of note as well, before we move on from these rather dry definitions, because of the election, we unfortunately can't be too specific around things like case studies and best practice in this presentation, unfortunately. So where possible, I will try to talking about hypothetical scenarios in which certain things might be useful, but just sort of a bit of a flag for that in case you weren't aware. So why are historic buildings important? Well, they're very important because basically we've got a lot of them, and funnily enough, when they were building them, climate change was not really too high on the agenda, unfortunately. And another sort of big reason I think we're really interested in retrofitting these properties is simply because we can't knock them all down and rebuild them. There's obviously the practical ability to do that would be enormously costly and all the rest of it. But there's also, thinking of it from a carbon perspective, there's a lot of embodied carbon in those buildings. And so, actually, in some cases, in many cases, knocking them down and rebuilding to make a more efficient building to save carbon wouldn't be too good, actually, if the aim was to save carbon. So as well as destroying the character of a place, actually sort of be running at a net negative, I guess, in terms of carbon savings, which is not what we want at all. I think that was sort of hinted at as well in the last NPPF before the one that just came out as well, which sort of really strengthened, I think, the environmental benefits and planning law, and there was an increased importance placed on that sort of thing as well. So that's carried through into the most recent version as well. So just being mindful of that, I guess. So just to sort of summarize, significant portion of the housing stock, they emit more carbon usually than typical homes because they tend to be draftier and less well insulated. There's specific requirements around sort of the planning law and also some of the technical stuff, and we'll get onto that in a little bit. Works have to be done in a sensitive fashion as well, particularly buildings with plenty of historical features. And there's a nice little maxim, I guess, down there at the bottom. The most sustainable building is one that already exists. We're not destroying things and burning loads more carbon to make something new. It's already there. We can repurpose it. So just again, to give a bit of a sense of scale on this, the UK has 10.2 million buildings built before 1944. And buildings contribute as a whole, I think, about 17% of our total emissions. So heat decarbonisation in particular for these buildings is a real big challenge, not just historic buildings, of course, but all homes. And there are, again, more difficult, more complications, I guess, involved in retrofitting historic ones. When we've talked about that sort of carbon life cycle and the carbon savings sorts of things, retrofitting is about 40 to 60% better generally in life cycle carbon terms compared to demolishing and replacing. And there would be a massive sort of economic benefit, to doing this stuff. So, 35 billion, I think, is one figure that I've come across there in terms of the amount of economic activity that could be generated. So it can be a really important part of local planning authorities plans when it comes to not just housing needs, but addressing economic and social needs as well. So community, economic prosperity, health benefits as well, especially if you're making previously very drafty homes much warmer to live in. I'm sure everyone's seen all those news articles about prescribing a fuel bill support and stuff for people living in fuel poverty. We know living in cold drafty homes is bad for people's health. And there's also the upskilling and employment opportunities which have been which have just discussed as well. And I think, as well as some of those very kind of obvious things, there's also and I think that sense of enhancing aesthetics of an area. If retrofit's done well, it can really help sort of just give an area a bit of a facelift and make somewhere much more appealing to live as well, which is, I think, sort of a co-benefit that perhaps we don't always talk about so much because we're very focused on health benefits and keeping people warm. But Ultimately for the people whose homes who are retrofitting on these kinds of schemes, that's certainly a benefit that they will come to appreciate. So building physics, bit of basic building physics. So when we are retrofitting to address a building's internal environmental conditions and improve the comfort for residents, we're also reducing the building impact on the environment. And when we do this, we want to basically stop the building losing heat. We want to manage the moisture movement through that building, and the movement of air in, through, around that building. Particularly those middle two bullet points. They're kind of that's where the complication, I think, probably comes in with historic buildings in particular. And there's also benefits around noise transmission as well, which is particularly appreciated from people living in historic flats or something like that. But yeah, everyone likes a quieter home. So the challenges that some of these properties might face, there might be higher embodied carbon within some of these buildings, disruption of aesthetics, as we said, moisture buildup. You've got to be very careful not to overly insulate things without adequate ventilation, or use materials which are vapor impermeable and don't allow moisture to escape. Many of these buildings, which were most of them built, around allowing moisture to move through them and letting the stonework breathe, for example, or solid brick walls to breathe, as opposed to more modern construction where we use things like gypsum and plastic, damp-proof courses, vapor impermeable membranes, those kind of things. And yeah, it also requires to not do those things, and to do those things that use more traditional building materials and approaches. That requires more traditional skills, which there might be less people with that kind of knowledge and capacity to undertake that kind of work. So yeah, again, extra complications. And issues regarding moisture. I think, as I'm sure there's probably people on here who have dealt with some of these buildings already in some capacity. But yeah, the moisture movement is the real killer for these things. If you get it wrong, it will destroy the fabric of the building, and that's completely the antithesis of what you're trying to do in terms of energy efficiency, but also those extra things that you're trying to preserve and conserve, in terms of the aesthetic features of historic buildings when it comes to planning direction. So building regulations. So this is a sort of a hypothetical example here of some of these issues, what they might look like practically. So you might have building regs state that a wall should be improved to 0.3 watts per meter squared, in terms of the heat transfer, the amount of the units of heat that can pass through, and how long that takes. So you've got a target there, and so you might think, okay, well, if I stick 45 mil Kingspan insulation board on or something, PIR board, it might it might be rated to that and allow me to hit that performance level. But you might not be able to do that because there might be aesthetic issues around the thickness of the insulation. It might put window reveals out of whack. It might have a finish that is not appropriate for the front elevation of a building, maybe, and planning one like that. So you might think, oh, maybe we can do it on the inside. Again, if you put that kind of thickness of insulation perhaps on a smaller property internally, you're losing a lot of space internally, and then you've got to move the skirting boards or the radiators and all these other door frames. There's lots of complications there. And if you do it using the wrong materials and without sort of being done in the correct fashion, you could create issues with interstitial condensation. So you might have warmed by not letting as much heat pass through the wall. The actual wall itself might get colder and retain more moisture, and then moisture might build up between your wall and the insulation material and create damp and mold that way. So it's got to be something that, you really got to do your surveys and speak with somebody technical who knows what they're on about with these particular materials and why they're appropriate or not appropriate for a particular building. And this is where, PAS 2035, I think, is really useful for something like, historic buildings. For anyone that's not aware, PAS 2035, it's the publicly available specification, and it's the one that's attached to all current waves of DESNZ schemes, whether that's HUG 2 or SHDF 2.1, 2.2. And it effectively manages the retrofit process from start to finish. So from the very first surveys that you carry out, making sure that you're talking to residents and all the different stakeholders involved, collecting all the correct data that you need to make an informed decision on the property, and then passing that information to somebody who's able to design a bespoke solution for that property, and sort of a medium-term plan that might sort of outline in what steps you need to do, what measures over the next 15 years or something. And then making sure you're monitoring and evaluating things clearly at the end of it. It also encompasses another PAS 2030, which is specifically sort of sets out how installers should be installing particular measures as part of that process. You do all the stuff, to get in there, in the door, doing the retrofit. That's where your PAS 2030 says you've got to do X, Y, and Z, and make sure if you've got this condition here, you're insulating below the DPC and all that kind of stuff. And then you've got your evaluation afterwards. And I think that kind of level of detail is really helpful for things like historic buildings where, because they tend to be much more unique and, vernacular, I guess, in their style and their build, it really pays to take a little bit more time to get to know the building and its occupants and how it currently functions, how you want it to function, and some of the limitations on what you might do to achieve that within the planning constraints available to you. So a couple of things or areas to focus on in these historic buildings. As I've said, we have to think about, what the current arrangements of the building are and what the corresponding measures to be installed are. And there will be varying levels of different risks, different costs associated with doing these kind of things. Some things might be lower cost, lower risk. Other things might be higher cost, higher risk, but they might come with, bigger benefits. So it's all about weighing up those kind of things. For some of the things you might be able to do for walls, for example, even just, repairing, repointing and repairs to permeable renders can make a big difference in just keeping something, warm, dry, and in good repair. There's no point in covering something with some insulation, even if it's the right insulation, if the thing it's being attached to is in poor condition. That could introduce all kinds of unexpected problems, and we don't want that. I mean, yeah, so to doing these kind of things, it's going to improve your air tightness and water penetration into the wall, and help it function, I suppose, more consistently. But the main thing with this sort of thing is, again, using permeable materials. So there's in that picture there, there's clearly it's a stone built wall. No idea what type of stone it is, but it's probably going to function in a way where water needs to be able to move through that, to avoid damp and mold issues. So you'd be wanting to use things like lime mortars and renders rather than Portland cement, or gypsum type stuff on there, which you could be using on more modern properties. Some of the other things that again you could do, you could completely render a property that's not had render before, and there's a little bit higher risk on this kind of thing, a little bit more cost. But again, you're stopping water penetration into the wall, penetrating as far into the wall possibly, and you're stopping air from kind of infiltrating through tiny cracks in the property. And again, should be using sort of permeable materials here, because you don't want to actually start damaging and destroying the fabric of the building. That's obviously not very good. So there's some suggestions there for materials, lime-based mortars, with things like hemp and cork, sort of added in these kind of, natural materials. That's the kind of, if you're thinking about, natural materials, if it's something that you could have feasibly found, 200 years ago, that's my kind of rule of thumb with it. You're kind of in the right ballpark for understanding, okay, it's probably going to be more appropriate to this kind of building. And lastly, there's sort of the highest cost sort of thing you might want to do, or but possibly with some of the greatest benefits in terms of improving the energy efficiency, internal wall insulation. So, as I've suggested earlier, there's a number of practical issues with internal wall insulation, with retrofitting it to properties, particularly smaller properties, which I live in a a 2 up, 2 down. Victorian mid-terrace. Some of these rooms are quite small. I'm always banging my hips on my shoulders as I walk around this house, and the stairways, like that. So, and it's about this wide. So there would be practical problems with installing, IWI within this home that I live in, simply based on the fact if I was to lose this much wall, internal wall area, or internal floor space rather, that's going to make moving around the property difficult and require moving a bunch of building services, plumbing and things like this, plug sockets. So there's those kind of practical problems, which is again a retrofit challenge from an engagement perspective as well, because if you're trying to do that with someone living in a property, that's a lot of upheaval for someone to sort of go through. So yeah, but even putting all those things to one side, again, you come back to that idea of, okay, how is the building supposed to function in terms of vapor and moisture movement? So we'd prefer sort of permeable hygroscopic insulation here, to kind of manage that, and so it's working with the way the building is supposed to work, in terms of managing moisture. But again, yeah, the thickness is kind of going to have to be possibly looked at in every case. As I've suggested already as well, issues with the IWI you can get where the walls outside can become colder because they're not sort of leaching as much heat through them from inside the building, and so because of that, the wall is colder. It's going to get wetter because of that. It's going to retain more moisture, and then there can be get issues with that's when you might start to get things like interstitial damp coming in between the wall and the insulation. All that stuff can be designed around, but again, it's another complication. It's something that your retrofit coordinator would need to be comfortable with in dealing with, and they should be comfortable dealing with it, because that's the point of doing that qualification. But it's just about making sure you've got the right expertise in place to manage those higher risks. So I did just want to talk again briefly about some other measures that are sort of worth looking at for historic buildings. Windows is probably the other really big one. So looking at either secondary glazing or specialist double glazing. Secondary glazing is not as good as modern high performance windows, but it can make a hell of a difference, and it can be a hell of a lot cheaper and easier to get through planning as well. So it's not to be sniffed at, and of course it is something that historically people would have had. When you think about storm windows and things like that, secondary glazing is sort of it's a well understood, probably in many cases sort of in keeping with the character of the building as well. So it's certainly something that I would consider, depending on the particular property and the particular restrictions of that particular property. As I said, if you are able to, you can get sort of specialist double glazing, wooden sash windows, for example, double glazing. Looking at a higher cost there, as you can imagine. If anyone's ever got new windows in, I'm sure you'd be well aware of that sort of thing. But again, different planning authorities might have different approaches to, or different feelings about that. So again, this is one of those things where it's really worth understanding with your LPA. What are you open to in this particular area? I've got these houses, I'd like to improve them. What's your feeling on changing the windows? Is that possible? Is it possible, but only with certain conditions? It's best to have those conversations up front before you've gone to the effort of procuring a specialist window solution, which is not even acceptable, from a planning authority perspective. Some of the other measures that will need to be considered: low carbon heating. If we're trying to decarbonize as a country, there's no way around it. The gas boiler will have to come out, or the solid fuel system might need ripping out and replacing. Again, it's very hard to talk in sort of broad terms about these, because the group of properties we're talking about here are all very diverse, but there are some sort of commonalities. Heat pumps have been previously, I think, quite controversial, possibly, for all properties, but there has, been an increasing amount of sort of news and research coming out to suggest that actually it's that they will work for historic buildings. That they're a key part of, obviously, heating across Northern Europe. We know they work in this climate, and I think, really, to be honest, the thing with heat pumps and historic buildings is just sizing them correctly. In many cases, in many cases they will be appropriate to use. It's just about sizing. You wouldn't stick a tiny combi boiler in a massive Georgian 6-bed house, would you? You might have 2 massive boilers in there or something. Yeah, the property isn't efficient, so you compensate for that with your heating system. So really, I think with heat pumps, it's just about understanding, okay, what is the heat demand of this property? And how are we able to reduce that with all the other conditions that we've previously looked at in terms of the walls and the windows, other loft insulation maybe, and then sizing a low carbon heating system appropriately to deliver the amount of heat that this property will need. And of course, again, coming back to those fuel poverty considerations, you do have to balance that side of things as well. So there is the wider policy background there, I guess, to kind of be aware of in terms of the extra levies that are currently placed on electric rates, which may or may not change in the future. We don't know that, of course, but it's just something to be aware of. It's another need to balance in these buildings when you're looking at decarbonising them. And then lastly on there, sort of another quite popular option, solar PV, and it's not necessarily going to be appropriate in all cases, but I do know of local authorities who may have done some things around this, using local listed building consent orders, but perhaps we can talk about that after the election. Planning. So just a bit more sort of detail and a bit more of a more lengthy look at planning here. Obviously, it can be a real headache, a real barrier in terms of getting stuff done, and not just with historic homes, but obviously generally, particularly for more complicated retrofit works like external wall insulation. And it can also be a real barrier in terms of area-based retrofit and addressing private rental sector historic homes that I think are particularly have a real particular headache, I think, for this kind of stuff. So, and again, it's difficult to talk broadly about because it's so specific to particular local planning authorities, where some planning authorities might have many more staff to deal with applications coming in. They might have more particular properties that require more complex measures, and therefore they are sort of struggling with backlogs and or don't have the capacity to sort of deal if you dump like a 50 or 100 home scheme on their desk in one go. They might not be able to work to that kind of. They might need a heads up, basically. So yeah, it's all very variable, and I think again it really underscores the importance, I think, of just trying to, where possible, build a bit of a relationship with the local planning authority. That might actually be possibly a little bit easier if you know, if you're a council, for example, and you're able to, I don't know, butter up somebody in the planning department over a beer or something, and just have those little informal chats, you know, just to get an idea of where those bottlenecks might be. That's the really important thing. Is understanding the bottlenecks and how you can sort of help manage those, really. Because you know, the NPPF, you know, does insist that this is a priority. You know, planners, you know, as much as it might feel like, you know, it's, you know, sort of, you know, bit of a barrier, bit of a headache. You know, this is a policy aim. You know, decarbonising homes, improving energy efficiency is a planning priority. So it will be something that, you know, they'll be interested in encouraging. It's just about, you know, how can I make your life easier? And you know, is there anything I can do to make this more agreeable, to get through the balances against, you know, your other drivers? What are your other sort of local policy objectives? How can I help engage with that to make this easier to get through? So I think I don't know if we've got a link in the chat to this. But if not, yeah, if you do want to have a little look in a bit more detail around some of those, you know, varying drivers, I guess, that are set out in the NPPF, in section 16, I think it is, in the latest one. That's where it's aiming to provide, you know, the greater clarity to LPAs about the balance between protecting listed buildings and energy efficiency. So if you kind of want to understand where that, you know, right at the top of that sort of thread, where that, you know, pressure, I guess, to balance those things is coming from, that's a really good section to have a quick read through, and yeah, just to kind of understand the background, perhaps. And of course, yeah, if you're able to, you know, get a copy of the local plan or engage with that in some way, I'd recommend, yeah, doing that as well, just to understand how that's being implemented on a scale that's, you know, particularly relevant to you. There's also a historic environment advice note, an HEAN, on climate change and historic building adaptation that Historic England published. I can't remember if this is in the resources at the end of the slides. I think it is, but if not, again, we can put it in the chat view, I think. Really, really useful document, this. Planning, if you're not a planner, planning sort of documentation can be quite dense and a bit of a headache to read. This is quite good for just helping decision makers, I think, relating to proposals for energy efficiency measures in historic homes, and how local policy can be a positive influence on that, and how historic buildings can help towards that. So it's kind of written for, you know, it's planning law for non-planners, I suppose. So it's quite good for just, again, getting your head around some of these different things. So again, LBC, just to come back to that, listed building consent, this may or may not apply to some of you, but you know, it's really important to understand if it does, because if you're doing anything to the building that's going to influence the character or appearance, so externally, that's kind of obvious with things like windows and external insulation, but even internal stuff, you know, if there are historic decorative features within a property, and you're going to be, you know, covering those up, or otherwise altering it with internal insulation, you know, it's going to be really important to get LBC. You can get an application form for it from your local planning authority's website. And it's just, again, important to try and have that conversation with your local authority conservation officer to understand, you know, whether it's going to be needed for your planned work. And yeah, I think this is the last slide on this particular section for now, because of the election. But if you are looking at doing sort of area-based stuff, or you know, you've got a particular bunch of archetypes in a particular area, it might be worth looking into local listed building consent orders, which are effectively something that just allows, as I've said, the LPA to grant listed building consent for an extended period of works of any particular description, for the alteration or extension of groups of listed buildings. So you won't have to apply for every single home. It might be something that you look to employ, for example, if you wanted to put lots of PV in a particular neighbourhood, this would be a great way to sort of facilitate that. So if there is something like that available to you, take advantage of it by all means. And if it isn't available, but it's something you want to do, I think it's worth just engaging again, local planners on that, because nobody's going to grant, an LLBC for something that nobody wants to do, are they? So, if it is something you're interested in doing that might benefit from this kind of blanket consent to kind of cut the paperwork on your end and make your life easier, start a conversation about it. Absolutely. So, yeah. I think from now, we've just got the resource slide, which will be shared, obviously, with the slide pack for this particular presentation. And yeah, we've just got the link there to that Historic England HEAN, and also the NPPF in there as well. There's also a couple of other useful bits in there. If you'd like to understand a bit more about PAS 2035, we do have a separate masterclass on that. But there's also a couple of gov.uk links as well about the complex decarbonised homes report, and adapting historic homes for energy efficiency, a review of the barriers, which sort of covers a lot of the stuff that I've tried to just give a bit of a headline of today. In addition to these as well, I don't think we've got the links on this slide, but I would really recommend engaging with anything from organisations, like SPAB or STBA, the Sustainable Traditional Buildings Alliance, I think it is, and the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, who are full of specialists who really understand this kind of topic area. It's their bread and butter, and if you've got a particular interest in really getting into the technical side of things, how do I install this, or how do I do this thing with lime mortar and render, some of these people like SPAB, for example, do run courses on that kind of thing. So yeah, if you really want to go to, down the rabbit hole, as it were, with a particular topic, I'd really recommend having a look at some of the stuff they've got out there, because there's some really good advice and training that can be accessed through those organisations.